John Atack, thank you so much for joining me and welcome. This is the second video I think we've done together.
It's only the second in all this time. Isn't that bizarre? Yeah. But we've been bad. We must communicate more frequently. And
communication is the universal solvent, John.
More communication, not less, is the answer.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, I thought it would be good to bring you on and talk about fair game, because anyone who is new to my channel, or even if you've been around for a while, you'll probably already be aware of what fair game is, how Scientology comes after its critics and former members. And there's a lot of evidence out there about how they've come after people like Mike Rinder and the Headleys and anyone that speaks out about Scientology. And I thought it would be interesting to talk to you from a UK perspective, because the pool of ex-Scientologists and critics in the UK is smaller anyway. There's less British people. There's certainly less British Scientologists than Americans. And so I thought, let's talk a little bit more from how things differ, or perhaps how things are the same from your experience with fair game in the UK. So you started speaking out, what was it, 1982? I think you said that you first started getting 83, getting fair game. What was the sort of first inkling when you first became a critic of them coming after you?
Well, it's fairly immediate. I'd done 6 major auditor training courses. I'd done the data series evaluators course, and I'd done the bridge up to OT5. I had 9 years in Scientology. I'd never been on staff, and I think I might be close to unique, as far as I know. I'm unique in that I was not abused or humiliated in any way during those 9 years. I was shocked to find out what people had suffered, the awful things that had happened to people. So in September 83, I put out a list of questions, which basically, is it all right to do this? See this policy. And I listed various things that the Commodore's messengers were doing under the direction of L. Ron Hubbard, as I later found out, and put the policy which said, you shouldn't do this. And that got me reported to ethics immediately, which, I know this sounds sad, but it was only the 3rd negative ethics knowledge report I'd had in 9 years. I was a very good person. I got commendations and all of that. And I sort of brushed that off because what I was saying was true. So done with that. And a couple of weeks later, this guy called Bevan Priest turned up as I was waking up. In fact, I was asleep, and he came into my bedroom and saluted me, and nobody had ever done that before, so that was pretty cool. And called me sir, and he said that there was an event in 3 days' time at the Crown Hotel in East Grinstead, and would I take charge of it, because he'd seen this thing that I'd written. So I was obviously drowsy, and I have thought about this conversation from time to time since. What if I'd said no? So I said, yeah, fine, great. And Captain Bill turned up, and which was, you can find a little bit of the video that we took that night, that I had taken that night, is up on one of Captain Bill's Runsorg free zone sites or something. Mainly with David Gaiman talking, the former head of PR. The first bit of harassment started right then. As we arrived at the Crown Hotel, this was the first ever public meeting of disaffected Scientologists, and I had nothing to do with setting it up. I was just made the master of ceremonies. And on the door were Robert Springall and Mike Garside, and they were members of what was just come into existence, the Office of Special Affairs, and they were stood outside on the street with clipboards taking the names of everybody that went in the building. I thought that was really chilling. The day after, my friend Uni Orca, who'd been at the meeting, was declared suppressive. So this was the first sort of, we are going to put this pressure on you. From there, oh dear, there were many people came as agents, because I just set up shop. I said, if you want to talk about Scientology, I will talk with you. And I found myself at the Captain Bill appointed me the chairman of the OT Committee UK. I had no idea what that meant. And I sort of became the public relations and legal aspect of the independent movement in the UK. And so a lot of that was stopping people from fighting with each other, because there's an awful lot of that goes on. When David Mayo's group wanted to destroy Bent Corridon's group and stuff like that. And I found myself in the middle of a lot of those situations. But people would come along and I'd talk with them for a few minutes and then go and make a cup of tea. And when it came back, they'd have left. And some of my materials had been stolen. That happened a few times. Then it got into the whole kind of private detectives and infiltration, so that my house was broken into twice and nothing was taken. One day I was woken by my front door being opened, and I went downstairs to find that my neighbor was letting a Scientologist into the house, and then the Scientologist saw me and went running. They'd come and knock on the door sort of 11 o'clock at night, and they'd always be in pairs. And remember this one particular occasion, this guy was, why had I persuaded his girlfriend never to see him again? And I asked him the girlfriend's name, and he told me. I said, I've never heard of her. I'm sorry. It's got nothing to do with me. And the other guy was, why was I attacking a group that had been, so resolute in helping junkies come off drugs, and he'd come off drugs through Narconon. It's sort of, well, that's up to you. But what I'm saying is true. I'm not making anything up. And most of what I'm saying is quoted from Ron Hubbard. Things like the fair game law, for example. And I found out later that the head of Office of Special Affairs Investigation Unit, I was called out by the Christian bookshop in East Grinstead for years. And anything that happened that related to Scientology, people would come to me, the police, the newspapers, whoever, for a dozen years. And they rang me up and they said, this young woman has come to us and she wants to leave Scientology. So I walked into town, got to the bookshop, and this is the point where they told her my name. They said, this is John Atack. And this woman did that. Oh no. And I said, well, the first thing we need to do, the churches together in East Grinstead will provide a place for you to stay tonight, and they'll give you your train fare back to Birmingham. It was, in fact. But the first thing we need to do is to go to your lodging straight away and get your stuff. And we need to take the police with us. And she was, we don't need the police. And I said, we do need the police. And the police back then were very helpful, I must say. They stopped being helpful after a certain point. But a couple of police officers came along. This is such a long time ago that we didn't have cell phones. If you can imagine that, in the primitive past of the Middle Ages. And so she went into the house to get her stuff. I went to the next door neighbour to borrow the phone. And I looked up and I saw the police car leaving. And a car pulled up and 4 people got out. 2 women went into the house and 2 men stood on the lawn to protect what was going on. So I went to talk to them, because I'm a gregarious sort of person. And this guy stood there with a tape recorder out in front of him going and shaking at me, which is great when you terrify people. It's a real buzz. No, it's an awful thing. And so I said to him, look, if you ever have any doubts and you want to talk to somebody, then give me a call. Next day, I got a call from the head of the Office of Special Affairs Investigation Unit. That she didn't tell me she was the head of it. And she said, you saw my husband yesterday and you said, if you had any doubts, can I come and talk to you? So, yeah, of course, come one, come all. We spent 3 hours talking. And that evening, I called a friend who had left Scientology a few months before and said, who is this woman? And he said, oh, she's the head of Invest. Okay. So she came back the next day for a little bit more, and she broke down. She admitted that it was an operation, that she'd been running operations against me for 18 months by that time, that she had been a child in Scientology and had had her own children in Scientology. She told me about one of her children losing all of his teeth because they used the barley formula, the stupid Hubbard barley formula, instead of milk, baby milk. So he'd lost all of his baby teeth, and it meant that his teeth would never properly recover from what had been done to him. One of the side effects of Scientology. And we set up to help her escape. And I went to the Anglican canon who was running the churches together in East Grinstead, and we set everything up because I actually was on my way off to the States to do work, and so I couldn't be there to do this. A week later I was leaving, so we arranged for her to pick up her 2 kids from school, and then Roger the canon would give us and them somewhere to live while they sorted things out, and I'd be back, and we'd sort something out. What actually happened was that she decided to tell her husband, who was her second husband, not the father of the children, and she basically told me that she'd married him so that she'd have a room, so she wouldn't be in a dormitory. It was that simple. So there didn't seem to be any affectionate bond between them. But she decided to tell him. And that's when Mike Rinder became involved. Curiously, this is, I think, the first time that our paths crossed. And she was sent to Los Angeles, where she was put on the rehabilitation project force. I think in all she was 3 years on the RPF, 6 months in Los Angeles at the time of the famous IRS War is Over event. She was there helping to clean up that. She was put into Rats Alley. Have you heard about Rats Alley?
No.
Rats Alley is part of the blue buildings, and in between the floors you have these, I'm told they're about 4 feet high, and there's a whole level where all the pipe work is run. And RPFers would be put into Rats Alley. Sam Domingo told me that she'd been there as well. In the dark, called Rats Alley because it's full of supersized rats. And they'd be given a torch and a little board that they scooted along on, because you couldn't stand up. And they'd have to clean all the grease and garbage out of this place. She was also put into the ovens where medical waste, because of course it used to be Cedars of Sinai, it was the Cedars of Lebanon. It was it was a hospital.
Yes. Yeah.
And it had not been cleaned out. I talked with people who'd found morphine ampules that had just been abandoned. In fact, the young man I talked to about that would have been 8 years old when he found a morphine ampule, and he and the other kids ran wild in the blue buildings. So, childcare, not much of a priority. Now, of course, Miscavige has stopped them from having children, so we don't have to worry about that anymore. But she'd also, so there were human remains in the crematoria there, and she would be put into this dank little Auschwitz sort of tunnel and cleaning out things there. All part of Scientology's fair game and general activity, in that this is fair game towards their own members. This is to humiliate and degrade and abuse and control. Even if the outer layer of Scientology has not brainwashed somebody or conditioned somebody into obedience to these ideas, then there is the RPF to, as a kind of slave labor gulag. So she was put through that, but she'd been part of the fair game. She'd been sending the people to my door at 11 o'clock at night. She'd been giving them questions. A guy apologized to me a few years ago. He said that he'd come over to St. Hill to study something, that OSA used to have meetings with the public, so whoever's studying there, and they'd be told, whenever you take a taxi, mention John Atack and say what a criminal he is. Okay, fine.
Wow.
I mean, a primary thing was handing out literature. I'd written 2 life histories. I was asked to write them by the Guardian's officers then was. One of them was, I'd been asked by Ira Chalef, when he was the commanding officer of the Manchester organisation, if I would start a celebrity centre in Manchester. We had a contact, the horn player with the Halle Orchestra was a Scientologist. So we had one person to start with. And Ira was, thought it'd be good for me to do this. And I thought, well, why not? So I applied to the Guardian's office and they had me write a life history.
Because Manchester is a known hotbed for celebrity Scientologists and still is to this day.
Absolutely. Imagine how successful Oasis would have been if they'd been Scientologists.
If only.
I mean, in reality, if you look at it, the Chick Corea was bankrupted while in Scientology. The Incredible String Band, who it was said in the late 60s, had actually sold more albums than the Rolling Stones, which is an incredible, and they were wonderful, they were brilliant guys. But their careers were completely devastated by Scientology. They went from being really famous and popular to not doing so very well. All in all.
Exactly.
But
so you had to do a life history in order to open a celebrity center. So this is how they gathered, they had dirt on you or information they could use at a later stage.
They had handwritten statements, and I found out that they were actually showing these to people. And I'm kind of going, well, look, confidentiality. Firstly, this is employer-employee confidentiality. Secondly, this is priest-penitent, and thirdly, it's therapist-client. So they'd violated all 3 forms of confidentiality. They weren't my lawyers, so they couldn't get to the 4th one, but there are only 4. And I made the terrible mistake of suing them over this. And
wow. What year would that have been?
1992.
92. And was that, I'm guessing that was a civil suit, right?
Yes, that's correct.
Had you, before you got to that point, had you taken any action police-wise, these with a criminal case? Because for those of you who are watching this from America, I think our system is slightly different to the States. But in the UK, if you report something, all criminal matters generally are dealt with by the Crown Prosecution Service. So you would report something to the police, they investigate, then they present a case to the CPS, who then decide whether or not to prosecute, and the case then becomes theirs. So it's the Crown versus whoever the person is, perpetrator. So if someone, for example, like Scientology, were harassing you and you were to take it to the police, even though you're the victim, the case is held and run by the CPS, and you are a witness. So, but sometimes the Crown Prosecution Service might decide there's not enough evidence, or there's no point in pursuing this because it doesn't benefit the public, because public money will get spent on the prosecution. So had you tried anything criminal-wise, reporting to the police and so on, for harassment before getting to the civil case?
I'd had conversations with the police in, I think when it would have been, in 1989, a guy called Douglas Brian Reynolds came to see me. He was driving a Rolls Royce with the initial DB1, Douglas Brian, or degraded being, depending on how you think about these things, but it was a Rolls Royce. He turned up with a bottle of Perrier Jouet champagne. That's the nice one with the Art Nouveau flowers on, and was very friendly. And he said that his father had made a fortune in hotels in Florida. And Florida was an interesting thought, and that he'd been a wastrel all of his life, and he wanted to do something decent. And so he wanted to support me in the writing I was doing. Particularly, he knew that I was writing a book, which was the book that became Let's Sell These People a Piece of Blue Sky, which sadly still remains the only history of the Scientology cult. People have added to it. Chris Owen and Antonio Ortega have added to it, but I would love to see somebody cover the period from 1990 to now. But it won't be me unless somebody wants to give me a lot of money, in which case I'll think about it. But he'd come along and he kept arriving, and just something felt very wrong. But I was at a point where financially I was in trouble, because I saw people for free. It just seemed wrong after somebody just been squeezed dry by Scientology to then charge them money to see them. But it meant that I had somehow to get money to support my wife and my two children, which made life complicated. So when this guy came along and said, look, I'll give you £30,000 if I can put my name on your manuscript. It won't be a book by John Atack, it'll be a book by Douglas Brian Reynolds. And I didn't go all the way with that, but I did make the mistake of letting him have a manuscript. And within a few weeks, that manuscript was in a court case in New York. And it all proved to be rather good, because we knew that there'd been rulings in the US on the Salinger case saying that you couldn't use unpublished material, which is to say Salinger had, I think, 78 letters that were in a public collection. Anybody could see them. But when his biographer quoted from them, he said, no, I could publish them and make money from them. And for a couple of years, the US courts went along with this stupid idea. There was a case with the Hemingway estate, with the Stravinsky estate. The case against Russell Miller was also brought on these grounds. And his publisher, Henry Holt, decided to withdraw the book, even though he won the case. They decided there was another case that could come along based on this unpublished copyright. Because I knew about that, the manuscript they had 60 Hubbard quotations from harassment orders, which is, that's a part of Hubbard that really hasn't been properly explored. I'm hoping that Chris Owen will get to that. And if he does, he'll make an amazing job of it, as he always does. It had Hubbard's private letters, the famous 1949 letter where he's saying you can rape women using my techniques and they won't even know about it. And there is evidence that he did rape women and they didn't know about it. The letter asking for psychiatric treatment in 1947, which is reprinted in my little booklet, Scientology, the Cult of Greed. These kind of things couldn't be used. His journals from his teen years, and I seem to be the only person who has them anymore, but he wrote 3 diaries when he went to China, 2 while he was there and a 3rd to improve on the content, which was a fairly typical sort of thing. But knowing that we wouldn't be able to use these things, I'd actually paraphrased all 60 of them before the case came to trial. So, but what was evident was that I was facing an enormous machine. There was me on my own. There was Gordon J. Melton, one of the great apologists, academic apologists for Scientology, put it on. It was on my Wikipedia page that I was at the center of the anti-Scientology movement in the UK. I was not only at the center of, yeah, it is indeed, and it was that case for many years. But being the center of the movement, when we elaborate, I was the movement. So of course I was the center of the movement. Nobody was working with me. Throughout those years, people came and went, and eventually Bonnie and Richard Woods worked with me and were eminent and wonderful people, did great work. But for the most part, it was me and an organization with 40,000 members and $2 billion. And Mike Rinder, of course.
Who at the time was a force not to be reckoned with.
Well, I'm amazed that I survived, looking back. I think we peaked at 10 court cases. I was sued in New York. I made the mistake of suing them here, which, what I hadn't understood is that when you deal with the legal process, it isn't a matter of you put the facts there and you'll get a just decision. No, it's a matter of, is my champion better than your champion? Is my lawyer better at technicalities? I lost that case on a violation of a discovery rule. Discovery is, you have to present all of the documents that might be relevant to the case. And what they got me on, And the law changed 6 months later because this loophole was found. What they got me on was that I presented financial records, but it was something like I'd given them my bank statements, but I hadn't given them my check stubs. And that was enough for me to lose the case for a violation in discovery. They'd got all the information. They didn't have all the places it was recorded in. And we found out what they wanted the check stubs for. There was a point where a guy went into my bank, pretended to be me, and tried to get statements because they wanted to know who was giving me money so that they could then fair game them.
Wow. And so what was that? So that was after you'd contacted the police, but nothing had come of it from a criminal perspective. What had you reported to the police? Harassment, stalking, that sort of stuff?
I was had a long conversation over a period of 2 or 3 years with a police officer at East Grinstead, who was quite something. You know, he was intelligent, he was concerned. What had happened was that a special branch had been ordered to release the files that they held on Scientology, and they sent them to East Grinstead police station. Now, a special branch had been collecting material from the 60s onward, and so this would be around about 1992, 93. They got this treasure trove of material, which I got that close to seeing because Friendly Copper was kind of easing the way so that he could get me in there. But they couldn't make anything of it because, as you said, there's a problem in which organization is harassing you. Now, I worked on cases in the US, and the first would be 1988, the Freedom for All in Religion, which was a class action of 410 people suing Scientology, with a steering committee of 6 people, including Hannah and Jerry Whitfield. And I went over to help them with their case, and they'd got 2 problems. The first was they hadn't proved that they were a class. They hadn't anything in common. And second was they hadn't proved that the people they were suing were a class. Miscavige had already got off the docket and had to be paid $5,000, I think, for the inconvenience. So I showed the corporate monolith argument. It's the first time it was put forward. It's the first time it was put forward, which basically showed that from affidavits that I had, from corporate documents that I had, that David Miscavige was holding undated signed resignations from every officer of every one of, I believe at the time it was 400 corporations. So at any time that he chose to dismiss somebody, he could, which meant as they say, I'd pierced the corporate veil. That was used in the Wollersheim case. It was used in the Corridon case. So Wollersheim was 9.2 million. Corridon, I think his building was worth 2 million. And it's that thing, because with Wollersheim, when it came time to pay him, it's a 20-year case. When it came time to pay him, they said, oh, Church of Scientology of California, which you sued, doesn't have any money. And they'd been shoveling the money out from there. And so we broke that argument by showing that there was just one corporation. That corporation is, in fact, the Religious Technology Center. That's the governing body. There was no such thing as the Church of Scientology. That was one of the first shocks for me when I left, to realize I'd resigned from a body that didn't exist.
Much like the Sea Organization on paper doesn't exist. It's a fraternal religious order you pledge 1 billion years towards, but it's just a spiritual commitment. It's not actually an organization. However, Religious Technology Center, Church of Scientology International, all the executive roles are staffed exclusively by members of the Sea Organization. So it exists, but not on paper. And that's one of the things they do a lot in the UK as a shield is, the UK Church of Scientology is run through an Australian registered corporation called Cosrecki. Yes. And Cosrecki on paper actually isn't affiliated with the Church of Scientology in America, other than financially. It lists the CSI and FLAG and other organizations like that as related entities, and those organizations loan to the tune of $100 million money to the UK COSRECI. And it's noted that it's not really a problem if we don't pay it back because it's a related entity. But David Miscavige isn't on any of the paperwork. And one of the things that I imagine will come up should any fair game suits be in the works in the UK would be that, well, it's all being spearheaded by CSI over in America, not the UK church. They're different entities. So the first question is, who do you sue? And piercing that corporate veil, as you say, is really, really important.
And the courts can be quite difficult about it. I was sued by COSRECI, the Church of Scientology Religious Education College Incorporated, which is a mailing box, a post office box in Adelaide. It doesn't actually have. They've got offices now.
It's now officially the address is the Adelaide org. So the Church of Scientology in Adelaide is now the headquarters of the UK Church of Scientology International. However, COSRECI, I think the building that Adelaide org is in, their lease is up. They're just renting the building, and the owner recently put it up for sale, and it was sold not to Scientology. So it's possible they're going to have to move out of there. And as much as Adelaide org is not the largest org in the world, I don't think it's ideal. It is the official headquarters of the entire UK church, including St. Hill, London, Birmingham. They're not run as separate entities in the UK. No. It's all funneled through this one corporation.
Yeah, and I mean, winding back to the idea of the Sea Org not being more than a fraternal religious organization. Of course, you have the code of the Sea Org member, and when you sign the contract, you're admitting the code. And the code says that you promise to uphold and follow command intention. So you're going to, in fact, give up your self-determinism for 1,000 million years so that you will be other determined within the context of Scientology teaching. For that time, you will be a slave for that time. You have just, in fact, given away all and any rights. And as you say, you're then staffing one of these organizations, not being properly paid, not being, your health and safety is certainly not a paramount consideration. And all under the direction of one person. Now, there was a model for all of this. When Larry Brennan, who became Denise Brennan, set up the corporate sort out in 1980, they were looking at the structure of the Catholic Church. Every diocese is separately registered. So when it's like piercing the compartments in a ship, that everything is sealed off from everything else. And it meant that during the awful child abuse scandals that have hit the Catholic Church, and we are talking about tens of thousands of cases. In Australia alone, there are 8,000 cases involving the Catholic Church. 500 priests were involved. And what they were able to do was to bankrupt a diocese by paying money out, but keep the whole thing afloat. I don't want to seem to be anti-Catholic in any way, but I am. It's just the way of it, that the way that the church has those negative aspects of the Catholic Church, and finding a way of protecting yourself in a corporate world. Scientology then followed the model of the Catholic Church, and I think should fall by the same reasoning, that if the Pope is the head and the Curia of Cardinals are the head of the church, then they should be responsible for what happens, especially if it can be demonstrated, and it can be demonstrated, that they covered up and concealed these things. Scientology uses this to shield itself. The reality is that there are three corporations that matter: Author Service Incorporated, Religious Technology Center, and the Church of Spiritual Technology. Church of Spiritual Technology took $500 million from L. Ron Hubbard's ill-gotten gains All of that money came from Scientology. None of it came from fiction. It cost them money to publish the books. So it all came out of the pockets of Scientologists, and from the labour of Sea Org members, and looking at the treatment they receive. I know, when they were filming at La Quinta in 1977, Hubbard got upset with the crew, and they were forbidden to have toilet paper. So they're not just on a diet of rice and beans and only getting 4 hours sleep a night. They were forbidden toilet paper. He, meanwhile, was accumulating briefcases, attaché cases, with $100,000 per case in them, stacked up against the wall, just in case he needed to, blow, in case he needed to run away from the many overts that he had committed, the many crimes he committed. That, bizarre imbalance that occurs. And then these people will be used as agents. One of the things that's not generally known, in 1981, as Hubbard started to worry that the Guardian's office was going to take over his church, his organization, I don't think the word church, which means, by the way, a Christian congregation, is really applicable to Scientology. So I do try and stop. And if we're going to call it a name, let's call it a cult, or let's call this an organization. It's most certainly not a church. Hubbard feared that it was being taken over, and he saw the first Mission Holders Conference in 1981, where people from the Guardian's office went along to mission holders, the people who hold franchised Scientology organizations, and said, "We've been harassing you, we've been spying on you, and we're really sorry." And Hubbard thought at that point, I'm going to lose it. It's going to be taken from me, because he was paranoid that there'd been infiltration by the FBI, or indeed the Markabians, who are a very interesting part of this picture, as I've recently found out. And so he got the Commodore's Messenger organization to go and break the Guardian's office. And the heads of the Guardian's office, those who didn't go to prison, of course, 11 people went to prison, including Mary Sue Hubbard, Jane Kember, the Guardian, and Mo Budlong, the head of Branch 1, the covert data collection, as it was called, the harassment division. What was evident was that all of these people, David Gaiman, Sheila Chalef, these people were all sent to be punished. They were called the Crims. They were forced to dig ditches under Miscavige's supervision. They were to be physically broken. I interviewed a number of these people that this program was used on. Charlie Parcell was taken from legal. His deputy, Rory Boulding, was sent to the Crims program. Strangely, though, the agents of Branch 1 weren't. So Peter Stumkey, for example, or Miles Mellor, who were both vigorous agents, harassment agents, were still working. In fact, in 1991, so 10 years after the dissolution of the Guardian's office, Peter Stumkey was still running operations against me. In the 80s, I worked on a documentary for BBC Radio 4 about Scientology, with a woman called Margaret Percy, and it was halted. And 18 months after we'd actually done this thing, and I'd been paid the £70, which was what I got as a fee for it, they broadcast it without coming back to me, and in it put the absolutely inaccurate piece of information that Ron Hubbard had been an intelligence, a member of Navy intelligence, which is completely untrue, and I can prove it, chapter and verse, from his own statements. He says he wasn't, let alone anything else. He was an intelligence officer, which meant that he explained to military personnel what enemy airplanes and enemy ships looked like, and he censored mail. He was trained to censor mail. That was it. Those were the entire. Margaret Percy had got this idea, so I was, how on earth why didn't you come back and check this with me? I could have shown you the documents that prove this is not so. And she was, oh well, So I called her producer, after the show had aired, and I'd written a letter to the Radio Times, which had been printed, complaining, and been fobbed off by a response by the producer. So I called the producer and I said, well, what happened here? And he said, people have really got the wrong idea about Scientology. Some of these Scientologists are really nice people. I go to a jazz club and there's this lovely Scientologist who goes there. And I said, what's his name? He said, Peter Stumkey. He said, do you realize he runs the harassment division? You were targeted. This was absolutely, and he just wasn't willing to accept it. They're nice people. So
yeah, I was just going to jump in there and say those tactics are very much still in play today. Almost carbon copy conversations I have had with people in East Grinstead, Mid Sussex District Council, East Grinstead Town Council, former mayors and so on. There's a huge safe pointing operation going on to try and, curry favour and win over local officials. And I always lead with kindness and compassion anyway with my activism, but the number one message I try and get across to politicians as much as I can is Scientologists are generally nice people, right? However, the people who you are dealing with as a politician are specifically agents whose job, they work 7 days a week, 14, 16 hours, if not more a day, no time off. They've signed 1 billion year contracts. Their whole existence is geared towards winning you over, right? The policy, and I'll put some policies up on the screen as an overlay while we're talking. The policy is to infiltrate government. It's to change their opinion and to gain control over the local government. And the way they do that is by making you feel special and saying, oh no, those people that are saying those horrible things about Scientology, they're anti-religious bigots and they've got crimes in their past, and whatever these lies are, this is what fair game is. So that the politician goes, I can't believe that they're these horrible, nasty people that you're saying they are, because all of my interactions with Scientologists have been really positive. And I always respond with, well, firstly, I've never said that they're horrible people. That's come from what they've told you in your own mind and how they've tried to change the narrative. But secondly, that's because they are literally, their whole existence is about making you believe that, so that you toss out the window any sort of accusations of abuse and that sort of thing. And it's really important to educate people, I think, especially government officials, on the reality of the dichotomy between the two things in Scientology. It's possible for Scientologists to be nice people and them also be running a covert intelligence operation that's aimed at infiltrating the government and smearing anybody that speaks out against them. Those two things are true at the same time. It's possible.
Yes, and it's important, very, very, very important to understand that the devastation caused in our society by sociopaths is because we find them credible, is because we believe in their good intent. And, charm is the fundamental method. So the idea of Peter Stumkey, who was, as you say, working a 16-hour day, 7 days a week, going along and having a pleasant evening at a jazz club, that wouldn't be part of his, I'll have a nice evening off. He wouldn't get any evenings off. He was there with a target, and he was absolutely successful. This was the amazing thought, that by persuading a BBC radio producer that he was a nice guy, therefore what was being said about Ron Hubbard would be true. And I got me 70 quid. They weren't going to give me any more money, but it was just outrageous. I mean, it's a side issue, but so I'll be quick about it. But there's just been a documentary called Making Manson that's come out. A company called Renowned Films. It's on the Peacock platform. It's 3 hours of documentary. Now, I spent most of last year digging into Charles Manson's connections with Scientology, and I was amazed that there is so much, and nobody has connected the dots. Nobody has said he had 14 months training in Scientology. Now, if you said he had 14 months training in Al-Qaeda, people would go, If you've said he had 14 months training as a hypnotist, you know, he had 14 months training in mind control. Well, he did have 14 months training in mind control, but it's only evident to people who understand the language of Scientology that, first of all, you see that famous Manson stare and you go, well, I've seen that before, you know, the 1,000-mile locked on eye contact. Then you find some of the words he was using. Then you find out that he was actually using Scientology procedures on his followers. Then you find out that he had an e-meter, which most people don't know. You find that he went to the San Francisco org when he came out of prison. It was one of the first things he did. He went to the LA org. He sent people to St. Hill. So when Renowned Films came to me and said, we want to talk about this, I was kind of, you know, I'm working on a book. I'm sorry, I can't just give you all the scoops that I've found. Do you want to hire me? We had 2 conversations. They didn't want to hire me. They've gone with a 3-hour documentary that makes no mention of Scientology. None. And they've tried to persuade people that Charlie Manson didn't instruct Tex Watson and the others in the Tate LaBianca murders, that they twice, I think maybe 3 times, repeat him on tape saying, I have no blood on my hands. In the same show, they've got him admitting or claiming to have committed murders in Mexico. He was also, of course, convicted for the murder of Donald Shea after the other killings. They don't mention it. So you've got this kind of whitewashing and cleaning something up and making it look like it's something else. Well, Scientology is incredibly good at that. And let's track that all the way back. Just before, while they were doing voir dire, checking jury members in June 1970 for the Manson trial, which would become, for a while, was the longest trial in California's history, Scientology had put out an order, which I have a copy of, saying we mustn't let people know that he was a Scientologist. And seeing how well that cover-up carries on, that you get somebody, Hubbard, every now and then he said something that's very true. And one of the things he said is, when you become too incredible, you become invisible. Scientology is too incredible. How could there be this international machine with tens of thousands of fervent believers who appear to be doing good for the community, or seeking to be doing, you know, with their little yellow t-shirts on, volunteer ministers, all of that? How could it be that these people are actually harassing their opponents with the intention of destroying them, ruining them utterly, to use Hubbard's expression about anybody that practices Scientology without a license? That's from 1955. He's already saying that. Destroying, there's a word he uses for opponents. So, and the fact that we actually have a government report, the Foster Report from 1971, that says this absolutely clearly, that gives the Hubbard directives, and you still have a problem going to, you know, local officials or to the police and saying, look, it's in black and white. This is their sacred scripture. They have to do this. They have no choice. Once you signed up for Scientology, you have signed up to eliminate, to hammer out of existence incorrect technology, which is to say you're going to destroy every other form of psychotherapy and religion, because they are incorrect technologies as far as Hubbard's concerned. It's hard to get that over to people. We go, no, they're nice people, really. I had a cup of tea with them and a nice bun. They were lovely. You know?
It's an extremist totalitarian belief system, and that's really, really important to get across. And I wanted to talk a little bit about, you mentioned there, you know, the extent to which fair game goes in the UK, because a lot of people that I've been dealing with have said, oh, you know, it's this crazy American cult. They do these things in America, you know, and I make the point, well, yes, there are less of us here in the UK, and there's less, therefore, Scientologists, and even more so, less ex-Scientologists, and of that proportion, less activists. But that doesn't mean they're not doing the same things, and the behavior doesn't exist, and it's still, you know, this stuff is still happening and has been for years. And you mentioned there about Radio 4 and how they went to the extent of planting somebody at a jazz club to, you know, have a social encounter that was totally not engineered in any way, shape or form.
No.
And that ended up in a smear against you that resulted in a Radio 4 thing being altered in some way. Like, that is a very complex system and a complex operation just based on one piece of press that potentially could have been happening at the time. But that's the extent that they go to with which to smear and suppress its critics. And I wanted to ask if you could expand a little more on your experience with stuff like that from a fair game perspective in the UK specifically. You know, we all know that there's the covert knocking on doors, telling neighbours that you're doing this, that and the other, and planting rumours in your circles and that sort of stuff. But what's your experience been like with more of the covert or extravagant kind of plans that have been directed at smearing your name or stopping your activism?
Well, there was a character who called himself Charles Poulter. His actual name is Cyril, I think, Poulter. He would later stand as a candidate for the British National Party, British Fascist Party. Thankfully, he was not elected. He came to me and said he wanted to do something about Scientology and could he help? And he was my chauffeur for 2 years. I found out because of the defecting head of OSA, that he'd been reporting to them from the beginning. So for 2 years, he was writing reports. He rented a room downstairs room in a house across the street from me. He used to live on Cranston Road in East Grinstead, a lovely house there called Avalon. And he had a camera set up at all times on my front door for 2 years. And was basically seeking to feed stories to me, was taking back anything that I might say. I remember talking with him about this thing of sound detection in a room, that you can use a window pane as a reflector. And by putting a beam on it, you can hear what's said in the room. Common intelligence trick. And the way that you foil it is you sellotape a coin onto each pane of glass. So what they'll hear is the vibration of the coin. It's old tricks. And I was aware of that, and in fact used to have my meetings in my loft, which nobody could train a beam on the windows of. It's silly having to know these things. You go to the police and say something like this, they're going, yeah, oh really? Well, yes, really. I mean, I had Stuart Lamont, who's a journalist who wrote a book called Religion Inc. Back in the 80s. And when he first came to meet me, he'd done a TV program for Yorkshire TV, and he said, they're being persecuted. I'm going to write a book about that. And I was sort of, okay. And he said, look, I've just been to America and I've met this lawyer, Michael Flynn. And the guy's totally paranoid. He says that they're going to take stuff that's in his trash and, you know, stick it all back together and put it into court. How paranoid. And I said, Stuart, they have. It's happened. But he'd fallen asleep by that time. He was a very strange man. It's like talking with the dormouse in the Alice book, you know. And what happened was that they then started harassing him. So he was somebody who was intent. He'd already made a TV show that was positive, and he was intent on getting over this point about how they're being harassed and we must stop this. And they started harassing him. So in the end, he wrote a negative book about them, which was not very accurate. And I mean, I was one of 5 people that he talked to. You know, Blue Sky, I listed it. There are 150 people referenced in Blue Sky. I was careful. I talked with a lot of people. But frankly, more than half of the book is Hubbard and what he said. You know, you don't have to go very far to find that. But yeah, seeing that perception that we're fervent, we must be paranoid in some way. We're not seeing what's really going on. And a stereotype is inflicted upon us. One of the other things I did, I wrote a little booklet called The Total Freedom Trap, which has 2 quotations from Ron Hubbard about how great total freedom is and how terrible total freedom is. And I've replaced it with Scientology's Cult of Greed. But it was something to say, you know, I've written this book, there's a history of the group that's really to help former members decompress. You know, let's sell these people. A Piece of Blue Sky was written solely with that audience in mind, to say this is what actually happened. this is who Hubbard was. Here are some of the many contradictions in his own statements about himself, which were then given to Russell Miller, who worked from my text to make his excellent Barefaced Messiah. But here is the history of the group itself and some of the many scams that it's been involved in. And the book was written without any critique of the technology of Scientology, because it was written for people who were recovering. And usually that's the last thing to go. They can lose belief in Hubbard, they can lose belief in Miscavige very easily. But the belief in the tech, that this, although the guy that put this together was a complete con man, it's really good for you. It's like, not sure that's true. But there's nothing in that book to do that. Total Freedom Trap was written for people who'd not had the misfortune to be involved in Scientology. And we put it out and had a little red cover. And within a few months, there was a little booklet the same size being pushed through all the doors in East Grinstead. And one day we caught a guy doing it. And boy, did he run. And this is an obscene publication, which basically you will be accused of child abuse, child molesting. It happened to Paulette Cooper. It's playbook. And the playbook, the same things will happen to you because the technology hasn't been allowed to change. All that's happened is that David Miscavige has outsourced Branch 1 to private detective firms who can then, if they get caught, it's their problem. So the guy who was hacking Mike Rinder and Tony Ortega's email, who was convicted in June 2015 in New York, I think it was. When somebody went to the judge and said, look, these are both people who are opponents of Scientology, shouldn't there be an investigation to find out who paid this guy? The judge said, no, why bother? So you've shown an absolutely clear connection, Mike Rinder, Tony Ortega, hacking. The playbook will be the same. The same things will be done. You'll be accused of being a liar. Your own success stories may be used against you. You see, he was perfectly happy then. Any disclaimers that you signed, I mean, fortunately, when I was a member, you didn't sign these contracts. But now people sign contracts saying, oh, we'll have to go to arbitration before we can go to court. Or, you know, these terrible, terrible criminal impositions, you know, and I'm responsible for everything that happens to me. You know, if you happen to push me off the top of a tower, it'll be my fault, that kind of thing. So, yes, I think it's very significant that Hubbard introduced fair game. I had a guy, he wanted to give a talk at an Inform meeting, our kind of cult observation group, about, you know, which one that tries to be nice. And, you know, you either go with the truth or you go with being nice in this world. And I fear, you know, better to go with the truth. Be nice about it, but
I have plenty of evidence to show how Inform has sided with Scientology on many occasions and are used by Scientology. If they need a cult expert to leap to their defense, they will use Inform because they've got very solid roots into that organization.
Very much so. I mean, after it was founded, I went to Eileen Barker, who was running it, and cozied up to her. So that what they were doing when I came along, I was a little bit shocked. If anybody had a complaint about Scientology, they were sent to St. Hill. They went to the chaplain at St. Hill. So for 4 years, I got all of the Inform referrals and kept very quiet about, you know, any negative attitude I had towards them. But it is unfortunate that in a liberal society, you've got this idea of, well, these people are being persecuted and we don't want this to turn into the Holocaust or something like that. So we better be, and you're kind of going, no, it's not that way around at all. It's not a matter of persecuting them. It's simply a matter of telling the truth about them. And it's then understanding that they are persecuting people. And that's very important.
It's separating beliefs and behaviors, right? Yes. And this is, you know, in the fair game that I've been receiving recently, there's obviously a huge increase of stuff that's going out there online, and one of the things they say is that I'm an anti-religious bigot, and like you said, they've used quotes from confidential, or so what I thought at the time were confidential petitions and documents and things in my PC and ethics folders. They've now been broadcast online. There's snippets and such. And they're saying, see, Alex says Scientology works. And now he's spewing anti-religious hatred online. And obviously, I haven't responded to any of it, but my position remains firm and the same, is that if people choose to follow the Scientology belief system, if they want to apply the tech, they're more than welcome to do so. I have nothing against anybody choosing to do that. You're free to believe in whatever you want to believe. I disagree with your beliefs. I believe something different, but it's fine if you want to believe that. But what you can't do is behave in the way that Scientology are behaving as a result of those beliefs, by harassing people online, showing up at their doors, using lawsuits to bankrupt people, forcing people to have abortions, hard manual labor, and all of this. The list goes on and on and on. That behavior is something that you can't do. Now the question becomes, is the behavior because of the belief? Can you have the belief system without the behavior? And that's another topic for another day. But I'm trying to make it really, really clear in my activism. You can believe in what you want, but you can't behave the way you're behaving. But that doesn't stop them from completely twisting everything that I've said on its head and using it as an attack tactic. And they just make stuff up a lot of the time. And have you had similar experiences with your, you mentioned you had a couple of court cases, one of which was against Kozrecki. How did they come about? Was the first time when you took Kozrecki to court for harassment, and then as a retaliation they sued you back, or how did that happen?
I think the first suit was Bridge Publications, which is the Los Angeles outlet.
Not New Era, which is the EU, the European version of it.
It was in New York. So
right.
It was because Blue Sky was being published there.
Right.
They sued me in New York. That was the first suit in 1989. I sued them, I think, 1992, which didn't go well. I also sued them for malicious falsehood, and we didn't win that suit either. We got into all sorts of technical difficulties. Then a variety of Scientology, New Era did sue me. Margaret Hodkin, the former founder, in fact, the creator of Greenfield School, she sued me for libel for 2 passages in A Piece of Blue Sky, which were about an interview that she had given to a 12-year-old girl. And what I was saying was that she had used Scientology procedures to find out about this girl's mother. And I don't think that's libelous. And I had witnesses, but we never got to court. They managed to kill it in pre-trial. It's called the paper mountain approach, where you just overwhelm the opposition. As I say, Wollersheim took 20 years from filing the case to getting his money. Most people fall by the wayside. The idea is to wear you out. So much of the harassment is trivial, but it's piling on as much as possible. Let's mention Neil Duddy, and Neil's been forgotten. Before you and before me, there was an Anglican vicar called Neil Duddy who objected to Scientology. And they managed to get the News of the World, the late and not in the least bit missed rag, the News of the World.
I was gonna make a joke there about that very well established and well respected media organisation in the UK,
which has the reputation of Rupert Murdoch behind it. The incredible reputation of Rupert Murdoch. They published a centre spread accusing Neil Duddy of having orgies with 15-year-old boys involving drugs in his vicarage. That was a final blow. that he had worked long and hard. He's been thoroughly ethical. This was complete nonsense, what was being said about him. He went on holiday, a walking holiday, and he walked off the side of a mountain. And the idea is to reduce you to such a frantic state that you cannot oppose them anymore. I mean, towards the end of, in 1994, I had a call from Greg Ryerson. I'd been told that there had been 9 missions launched against me from Los Angeles. They had all failed. I was still talking. So his was the 10th, and he the guy that finally did it. I have a recording of the conversation that we had where he basically said, how would it be if we have this art dealer? How would it be if we set up a contract so that he would buy paintings from you and you wouldn't say anything anymore? And I'm afraid I'm not going to repeat the obscenity, but I told him to
do one.
Go away. Yes.
Yeah.
I was a little bit angry about that. Looking back, I should have taken the money, obviously, but no.
I disagree with that one, John. I think
it's a
gain, yeah. But finance is important. Yes, earn money, absolutely. But I think the work that you have done, if you'd have taken the money and had not spoken out and continued doing what you've done, like, we wouldn't have this wealth of knowledge that you have shared with the world and the activism you've done for people who are just coming into this movement as supporting the anti or ex-Scientology movement, whatever you want to call it, SPTV on YouTube, like, it's nothing new, right? The fight against Scientology's abuses has been going on for the same amount of time Scientology has existed. And there's a lot of new people coming into this that I want to make sure people are aware. I'm not the first person to speak out about Scientology in the UK. I won't be the last. There are lots of people who've done it previously, and there was the whole anonymous movement, let's not forget. And that was a huge thing when, with the internet being utilized for the first time to spread news about what Scientology actually is. And prior to that, you had people like you, and prior to you, there were other people who were trying to raise awareness of the dangers of this organization, what's going on. So sorry, a little tangent there, but it's important for people to note that there's nothing new about their tactics. There's nothing new about this movement. It's just it's always evolving and it's always changing, but some things always stay the same. And it's important to note what's been done in the past, because the same things will happen again. They've just increased their armory with tools and weapons that didn't exist before, like the internet, for example. They couldn't conduct a social media smear campaign against you in the 80s because social media didn't exist, whereas now it exists. They're using it, but they're using it in the same way that they were distributing booklets or speaking to the press way back when, before social media existed.
Absolutely. And of course, before I backed off in 96 for the first time, we had access to the internet, and they were on social media, and I was. In fact, in 1993, there were more hits on my name than on Winston Churchill's name on the World Wide Web. That's how unpopular Scientology had become. It wasn't because I'd become popular, sadly. I was going to tell you about the Inform conference where an independent Scientologist came to me, and I'm friendly to, I've been called an anti-Scientologist, and that's the one thing I'm not. I'm a pro-Scientologist. Have been here to help people. So I protected the independents from another cult. I was involved in litigation that defended people's right to practice Scientology. So even though I think that Scientology generally has bad consequences for people who do it, nonetheless, I detest what you say, but I'll defend to the death your right to say it, something like that. But this guy came to me and he said, when did the harassment start? So I said 1952. James Elliott stole the mailing lists of the Wichita Foundation, late 51, early 52. And he said, no, after David Mayo left, when did the harassment start? It's like, no, it was there from the beginning. So, as you say, there are many people who've gone before us. The first significant one would be Dr. Joseph Winter. Dr. Dr. Joe Winter. I'm not sure if Joe Cocker was actually called John, not Joseph, and it may be the same for Winter. But Joe Winter was the doctor who worked for 3 months on Dianetics with Hubbard before he published Dianetics, Modern Science, Mental Health. There was him, there was Don Rogers, who I interviewed at some length, and there was Sarah, the second, not actually his wife, because as he said, he had no second wife, he had a first and a third wife. That's in the shrinking world of L. Ron Hubbard. So this Joe Winter, when Hermitage House, the medical publisher who'd published, Art Sepos, who'd published Dianetics, Modern Science and Mental Health, realised it was a fraud. And they withdrew the book. Having sold 150,000 copies, even though the publisher was making money, said, this is fraudulent. And he turned to Winter and he said, I want you to write a book. And he wrote a book called A Doctor's Report on Dianetics, where his perspective was, he thought Dianetics was a good idea. It isn't, and we can get into why that is, when we've got another hour to spare somewhere. It can actually cause a lot of damage, and has done. Sometimes people benefit from it. That's up to them to decide. So Winter was absolutely defended Dianetics as a practice, but lambasted Hubbard as a human being, which needed to happen. That this guy managed to bankrupt 5, not 1, but 5 foundations that were doing massive business by taking all of the money out of them and spending it. There's a day when he actually walked into a car showroom and bought a Cadillac for cash from a bankroll in his pocket, and this was all money that had been put into these foundations so that he could research and do all of this stuff. And from then on, James Phelan should be mentioned. He's almost never mentioned. And it was Phelan who in 1963 investigated Hubbard for the first time and found out that what he was saying about his schooling, his military career, his study with gurus was simply not true. And Alexander Mitchell, who in 1969 found Hubbard's connections with Aleister Crowley, which led to the Sunday Times printing an apology to Scientology, written by Scientology, which said, Ron Hubbard broke up black magic in America. He certainly took all of the money from Jack Parsons and ran off with his girlfriend. But black magic, I fear, continued in a very strange way through Scientology itself. But that is a topic for another conversation. But it is my confirmed belief that Scientology is what's called a magical working. It's a process to bring people into psychic slavery to L. Ron Hubbard and to the memory of L. Ron Hubbard, so that he will, in his own words, smash his name into history, which, as he said in a letter to his first wife, was his only goal.
Yeah, absolutely. And John, I'm conscious that we have gone over the hour that we had set aside for this. So I think let's try and wrap it. There's obviously so much more we could talk about. We'll have to do more of these, but I think let's wrap it up here. And bring it to a close with this question of, we talk about fair game in the UK, how it's been, we talked about the history that's been going on for a long time. It hasn't stopped, it's evolved. You've talked a little bit about your experience. What message would you like to give to people who perhaps are looking to speak out, or who are activists, or perhaps it's someone who's an East Grinstead town councillor, or someone who's a local politician that is seeing all of this stuff about Scientology abusing people and so on, and all of this, and is just kind of thinking this can't quite be real. They can't actually be doing this. What would you like to say about fair game, specifically in the United Kingdom? To that sort of wider gamut of people who are interested in it?
Scientology's policy is scriptural. Everything that L. Ron Hubbard said, according to Scientology, has scriptural value. His directives have to be followed. When it came to fair game, of course, they will point to the cancellation of fair game policy letter of 1968, which says, we don't use the term fair game anymore because it causes bad public relations. The practice has never been cancelled. As you say, the belief and the behaviour are distinct things. So the behaviour is not only an aspect of Scientology, it is a spiritual necessity. in the same way that a Christian is expected to pray, the Scientologist is expected to harass opponents, is expected. It's part of keeping Scientology working, the series of policy letters, which when you extrapolate it is saying, we're going to clear the planet. Everybody is going to be clear. Anybody that opposes us is opposing mankind's only hope. So you've got that kind of fervor in the background. It's easy enough to study. You can find out, I mean, my own book probably has more in it than any other. Let's Sell These People a Piece of Blue Sky. You have a record of at least 100 operations. When I contacted the Home Office back in the 1980s and said, I found the names of the 2 agents who were put into the Home Office, I didn't get a reply. We know they were in the French, Greek, Italian, Spanish, Canadian. They were prosecuted in Canada successfully. People know about the American prosecution, but there was one in Canada too. 11, of course, including Mary Sue Hubbard. 11 people were sent to jail for what they'd done. But what they'd done was international. It had happened in this country. And the pattern will be the same because it's a policy, because it's sort of an instruction manual that they're working from. They will do exactly the same things. And if you're thinking about being active, the first thing is to think about what damage might be caused to you. I have met a lot of people who say, I don't want my children to know about the sexual peccadilloes of my youth, so I am not going to speak out. I understand that perspective. The great change, I mean, Arnie Lerma, the late and very eccentric Arnie Lerma, said of me before the internet and safety in numbers, there was John Atack. And that has, there were a few others. I wasn't entirely alone. Lawrence Wollersheim and Jerry Armstrong, and Bob Penny and some wonderful Marjorie Wakefield, some wonderful people. But there weren't many of us. It was very small. What has happened now is that there are thousands of people who feel enabled to speak out. The first layer of that is that you can register something anonymously. It used to, I can't remember what it's called now. It used to be called I Got Out, where you could just put up your story anonymously. I think to tell your story is very important, to then understand that if you do speak out, you are at risk of harassment. Having said that, the harassment that happened to me for the 12 years I was active, and 4 years beyond that, it kept going for 16 years solidly. That when I came back in 2012, I did the big questions, the BBC thing, and did OT3 in my best L. Ron Hubbard voice, and got stopped by Nicky Campbell, which I think was a shame. I think the whole 75 million years ago in this sector of the galaxy. I thought it was great, but I didn't even get a lawyer's letter afterwards. They'd alerted me to the fact that what had changed was nothing in their practices and procedures. You're now top of the list in this country. There's you, and probably Pete Griffiths over in Ireland is still high on the list. For some reason, I have almost been left alone. So that's to reassure people that if there are enough of you, the harassment will be minimal. And part of that will be when I moved away from East Grinstead finally in 1994. So after nearly 11 years there of standing up, the harassment diminished incredibly. And it was like, oh no, these are liability formulas. They're sending people out, and because they'd have to drive now 60 miles from Manchester to come and do it, and come to the end of my cul-de-sac, and we did have private detectives all over the place for a while, it makes it more difficult for them. I would say keep a journal. Anything that seems suspicious, anything that might be them, make a note of it. Have floodlights on your property, and preferably cameras, so that you can record anything. If you get into conversations with them, record those conversations. You can be sure they are, so that you know what's going on. But I think what needs to happen now, and you're leading this in this country, what needs to happen is for people to complain to their MPs, to complain. It's appalling what East Grinstead Council have allowed to happen. When you told me what was going on, I wrote to the mayor and I sent a copy of Cult of Greed and got a nice letter back. And of course, nobody read it. And it's sort of,
no, he didn't
taking
read
a hand
that.
out. You met Tom Cruise,
Yeah, he just, I was copied into that email. He said, "Thank you very much. I'll give it a read."
Yeah.
He didn't
Nothing
read
else
that.
happened.
Nothing else happened. No.
And so insisting that our representatives do look at the material, I mean, with anybody who's an MP or in local government, they should read the Foster report. It's the government's own report. And the guy who did it was the Queen's Counsel, a barrister. He was a member of Parliament and he was a knight. So it was Sir John Foster. He was an eminent man. And it is a brilliantly made piece of work. And his recommendations at the end, which I think fell very much on deaf ears, are true to this day. What he said is that we've given charitable status to too many groups, that where a group is actually going out there and saying we're recruiting people for our religion through our charity, they shouldn't have charitable status. I'm happy to say that they've never achieved charitable status here, though Narconon has charitable status. And of course, the Unification Church, the Moonies, have charitable status in this country, which is outrageous given what we know about these groups. But I think pointing people toward, it's good that they point people towards my work. My work has been supported by, there was a day when 40 academics signed a petition supporting the veracity and the probity of my work. So many academics have supported it. There is, if somebody can question a piece of evidence, then that's fine. When they came to do the dead agent pack, this thing of saying what's wrong with something, there were 60 points on the dead agent pack. 57 of them were answered in the text. So they said, he says it was banned in Victoria. And I do say that. Fact, it was actually, the ban was lifted. And it's like, yeah, if you read further, this is what's called chronological. You'd find 57 of the 60 points. The other 3 were all Vicky Asnaran. They were all things that she had sworn in affidavits and then, having been given a payoff, had claimed perjury for. So I decided to leave them. And in fact, when the book was read by Stacey Young, became Stacey Minton, Stacey Brooks, wonderful woman, she had written the dead agent pack on Ben Corridan's book. And she said, I read Blue Sky and there was nothing in it. But if people aren't willing to trust me, and I understand that, they have some idea that have some kind of axe to grind, I'm not upset with anybody. I'm just trying to help people who've been harmed and are being harmed, just as you are. There are 4,000 slaves in this organization. I find that appalling, the fact that there are slaves in this country. It's just unbelievable. And nothing has ever been done about that. The Rehabilitation Project Force was never raided by the police in this country. It's just despicable. So we need to change our laws. We need to take the Coercive Control Act of 2015 and say, well, if it applies in an intimate couple, if psychologically coercive control can happen, then a group can do it. And we need to protect people. We need to protect somebody against their spouse. We need to protect them even more if they're part of the Jehovah's Witnesses or, the Plymouth Brethren or the 12 Tribes or any of these extremist groups. People need to be protected from them. We need to have some kind of legislation that will allow people to say, I was enslaved and I want compensation for that. At which point there would be no Scientology anymore if they had to pay the people they've damaged. Yeah,
absolutely. And it's real. This stuff is real. And your point there that there are modern slaves, like people who are working for Scientology don't even realize that they are living a life of modern slavery. And it's really, really important to educate people on, firstly, what's happening, B, that it has been happening for so many years and see why it's important that it stop happening. And then D, how all of that stuff can be done with existing legislation, right? Already there's so much that could be done with what we've already got, but it just hasn't, because that education piece hasn't happened yet. So that's what I'm going to keep doing my best to try and educate. And, you know, like you said, I'm definitely taking the brunt of it fair game wise in the UK at the moment, but you know, it's something that is expected when you speak out about Scientology, but it's not something that should be accepted. It shouldn't be, oh, well, that's okay. I decided to speak out and therefore I should accept the fact that they're going to say these. No, that's where I draw the line. Yes, it's not a surprise, but no, I'm not going to allow it or accept it. And, you know, harassment, all of that stuff, malicious communications, it's all really important to report anything that happens to you. If you're standing there with me at a protest, or if you've gone and done your own thing and messaged a member of parliament or written something on social media and you are receiving fair game, report it straight away to the police. The police may come back and say it's a one-off incident, there's not enough evidence to continue, or we're not going to do anything with it, but you've made the report, and what that does is build a case that shows over time the organization itself is going after people, and every little report here and there is helpful in the fight, I think.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And you know, to take responsibility for this is important. I had never intended, you know, I was a Scientologist for 9 years, but I was never on staff, let alone in the Seahawk. And they wouldn't let me start a celebrity centre, fortunately. And so I worked as a writer and a painter during that time. And when I left, I had no intention of standing up to them. I left because I thought Hubbard was gone and that Scientology was in danger and Scientology was a good thing. Within a few months, I had changed my mind. I decided that Scientology was not a good thing, that it doesn't in fact make sense. That's the conclusion I'd come to when I applied the data series to the data series. It doesn't make sense. And there was one principle that Hubbard had put forward, which is honesty is sanity. And it was very apparent to me that he was a dishonest man. He contradicted himself. You know, I told...
I was just going to say, sorry, therefore using his own words against him,
his own criterion.
Insane.
Yeah. So, I mean, and I've told this story many times, when I pointed out to somebody, Vicky Ballard, who'd been the commanding officer of the St. Hill Foundation, who was a friend of mine. And I said, look, he says here that he was crippled and blinded at the end of World War II. My philosophy, handwritten, on display at St. Hill. And he says here, I think 1957, Communication and Isness, a professional auditor's bulletin, which is still in the technical volumes, that on July the 25th, 1945, he beat up 3 petty officers in Hollywood, not 400 miles away at Oak Knoll Hospital. So how was it between the 25th of July and August the 14th that he was crippled and blinded? And she looked at me and she had the answers. She said he had 2 bodies. It's like, why didn't I think of that? I wonder how many bodies he actually did have. But by saying honesty is sanity, the road to truth must be trod with true steps, the rug was pulled from under my feet. It was like, this man's a liar. And then finding out the obscene and despicable things that he had done to people all around him from the very start, you know, his whole life going back to his teens, he was just an awful, awful liar. You know, a story to finish on that, he talks about beating up 4 members of, I think it was the O'Connell family, when he was a kid, when he was 8 years old. And Russell Miller, who did some great interviews, went and actually found a record of the O'Connell family. They did exist. He said he'd beaten up all 4 kids. He was 8 years old. And he talks about jumping off a fence and using this special form of fighting to beat them all up. The oldest O'Connell boy, he was 8 years old. The oldest O'Connell boy was 18. Sort of, yeah, I think this might be a little bit fanciful. If we come to the 3 petty officers story in Hollywood, that's true. he was in a fight in Hollywood at that time, but it was 2 petty officers, not 3. Let's just, get exact. And he was summoned as a witness in their court-martial. But he didn't beat them up and he didn't gouge one of them with a bottle, as he claims in the thing. He just got into a fight with them. And even though he was crippled and blinded, he managed to walk away without a white cane or anything. Just finding this thing out, this man was such a monstrous liar, has to give you pause for thought, should be sort of back up. Talking with Karen de la Carriere a couple of years ago, and she said, every time you say to somebody, Scientology does not do what it claims to do, there are no clears, there are no operating thetans, there's nobody with supernatural powers, they can't communicate freely with anyone on any subject, that's for sure, and that's at the very bottom of the bridge. She said, but every time you say that, they'll say, didn't you have any wins? And that's their kind of, yeah, I felt euphoric because these hypnotic procedures are used on me. But, there are cheaper ways of getting high that are less addictive than Scientology,
and less harmful. And that's the point. Is
socially
didn't you have any wins? It's like, well, yeah. People would be lying if they were to say that they didn't have wins in Scientology, right? No one would join Scientology if there weren't bits in the beginning that, tools or tricks they could use to improve their life in small ways here and there. Like, that's how it works to get you in. And a lot of it is a result of hypnotic process, like you mentioned, this euphoria out of an auditing session and so on. But irrespective of that, the behavior is abusive, right? I don't care how euphoric or how much of a win something is in Scientology. You can't lock people in rooms, force them to have abortions, put them on hard manual labor, harass people, all this stuff. That is what needs to stop. And my question, maybe one to leave it on, is why can't we have a world where people, if they choose to believe in that, they can, and they get their wins and their highs, but without the abuse? And that's the thing. I don't think it's possible to have the two. Because it is such a key part of Scientology. Like you said, Hubbard was a liar, and it's built into the structure of the belief system itself. But that's another topic for another day.
After I'd left and before I'd stopped believing, so I'm still very much in, I started contacting suppressive people. This was my interesting adventure of the last part of 1983, and I found out where Cyril Vosper was. Cyril had written The Mindbenders. In the original edition of Have You Lived Before This Life, he is one of the auditors and one of the pre-clears. His name, for some reason, was taken out of the book later. And so I wrote to Cyril and I said, you can now do Scientology outside of the organization. And he wrote me this very sage letter, and we became good friends afterwards, in which he said, I don't think that Scientology will work without the fascism of the organization. It's like, you could have a point there, the context of the organization. And surely good in the world is not about you having wins or how great you feel. Surely that's narcissism that we're talking about there. What's good in the world is how you manage to help somebody else, not how you help yourself,
Exactly. And let's end this on the Charity Commission's 1999 ruling, which was that Scientology doesn't benefit the public. The practice of Scientology is an inherently private thing that may or may not benefit an individual, but there is nothing about Scientology that helps the public. That's what they decided in 1999. And one step at a time, let's look at the abuses, and let's say, hey, look, councillors, politicians, law enforcement here in the UK, we're not asking you to review the religious doctrine and rule on what can and can't be a religion. We're asking you to just look at their behaviors and whether A, it's legal, and B, whether it should be happening. The religious belief, so-called, is another topic for another day. But first, let's just look at the fair game. Let's start there. So it's a starting point, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Are you okay walking onto stage, accepting a check as a mayor for your charity from someone who's being paid £50 a week and is effectively a slave, you know, are you okay with that? Would you take a similar check from a slave that was part of, like you say, Al Qaeda or something like that? Probably not. So let's just look at their behavior as a starting point. But anyway, John Atack, thank you so much for joining me. And we covered so much today. We'll have to do a part 2 again sometime soon.
Yes. Yeah, let's do something in a few weeks' time. That'd be great.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Thank you so much, John.
Thank you.